Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this afternoon's session of this excellent conference. I'd like to thank the conference organizer, Richard Bourne, and the Commonwealth Journalists Association for putting together such a fantastic program, which has offered a real wealth of knowledge, expertise, and also possibilities of networking for young journalists. We've had this morning the views of 3 levels of the journalist profession from 3 Commonwealth countries, producer, editor, journalists, and all of them have given comparisons from their perspective of challenges and opportunities, trends of reporting, and the various dimensions, and what an exciting profession it is that you are moving into. So this afternoon, we are moving in a different way. So from sport and politics, we're now going to be talking about politics and politics. This panel is going to be looking at the Commonwealth as an international organization, a network of networks, it's been described, which operates at multiple levels, at the level of government, at the levels of civil society organizations, and professional organizations. And of course, the Commonwealth Government Association is one, the Commonwealth Journalists Association is another. The themes that will come up in this panel's discussion will elaborate on themes that came out this morning. Stories that matter, making them relatable, showing the relevance. Journalism is changing rapidly. Nothing can be taken for granted. The importance of holding those in power to account. Now, as has been underlined, we're living through very interesting, possibly too interesting and turbulent times. Breaking news, fast-paced journalism. Now, the Commonwealth, on the other hand, I think, is the equivalent of slow news, which is a challenge when you're reporting in a news culture which, let's face it, is if it bleeds, it leads. So this is a very different type of organization which presents a different set of challenges to those who are reporting on it. Normally, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which has just taken place, of course, in Kigali in Rwanda, that type of meeting only makes the news if it's controversial. If it's going to get attention, only then is it newsworthy in the mainstream press because it's contentious. And of course, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting became newsworthy in the UK because of the Rwandan migration deal. Elsewhere, Commonwealth coverage around the time of the Kigali summit was different, and this question of perspective is always important. Down in New Zealand, the press was focusing on the fact that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern did not go to Kigali. She chose instead to go to a NATO meeting. In Australia, the Prime Minister of Australia chose not to go to Africa and was criticised for that. South African president similarly didn't go to Kigali. That led in South Africa. Now, the big news stories in Kigali were the challenge to the leadership of the Secretary-General, Patricia Scotland, and that she was being openly supported by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Prince Charles's address at the opening ceremony, where he expressed his profound sorrow for the suffering of slavery and its legacies and the need for an open and honest conversation about this, also was part of the news hour. The time is now, said Prince Charles, representing the Commonwealth's ceremonial head, the Queen. Now, of course, that wasn't all that was going on in Kigali. Around the Commonwealth Summit, there are other meetings. There are business forum, there's the Women's Forum, the People's Forum, Youth Forum. And Channel 4 had a very interesting debate about the Commonwealth and trade, climate change tensions between small island states who are facing an existential challenge, an existential crisis with rising sea levels, and the tensions within the Commonwealth with the big emitters. And of course, India is deemed to be a big emitter, as is Australia. So there were other potential news stories there, but then after the Commonwealth Summit, the news cavalcade moved on. Now, I say the news cavalcade because I was drawn in and asked to contribute to a number of news stories, SABC, Chinese television, CGTN, the BBC, Times, etc., and to comment on what was going on down in Kigali. And I kept being asked 3 questions. What's it for? Is it relevant? And what's the future? Now, I would like to alert you as journalists please be aware of the people that you're interviewing may be very adept at answering what seem to be straightforward questions that you want to convey. They may have developed the techniques to get around that. So it's not simply your techniques which you are honing. Think about the other person's skill set as well. How are you going to get that story and how get around them? Because I'm afraid I developed my responses to the questions that I had anticipated. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to this meeting three experts, three very different perspectives on the Commonwealth. A perspective from the Caribbean, a perspective from Canada, and a perspective from Nigeria. And I am going to ask them, right, the Commonwealth, is it relevant? What's its future? And I'm going to press them. And I know that this is going to be a very energetic discussion, and you will get the benefit of three perspectives from a diplomat and former leading academic and journalist, from a former politician, a leading senator, and from a leading Nigerian academic. So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce Professor Eghosa Osaghae, Director General of the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs and former Anyaoku Professor, Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Then I will invite Sir Ron Sanders, Ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda in the United States, a member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group 2009 to 2011 to speak, followed by Hugh Segal, Director, Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute, and member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group 2009 to 2011. Richard Bourne has asked that each speaker should speak for 10 to 12 minutes, then we'll have an interaction, and then I'm very keen that there should be interaction from the floor. So if I could invite Professor Osaghae to begin.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you very much to Richard and all those members of the Journalists Forum who have put this together. Very quickly then to this subject. We have to look at the Commonwealth between Kigali and Birmingham. I think that, you know, the introductory remarks that you have made give us points of entry. I mean, the fact that, you know, there are different directions in which even member states are pulling, Australia, you know, South Africa, and so on. It's interesting that, you know, all of these kinds of, some of them contradictory pulls actually signify the fact that the Commonwealth is up for redefinition, reinvention, and reimagination. And I think that, you know, the point has always been about the relevance of a body that had a colonial past, continuing to exist even at a time when colonialism is no longer the fad, but has been taken over by forces of decolonization. And questions have been raised about how far the Commonwealth itself can serve as a platform or an instrument of decolonization. Now, for many former colonial states, it is that kind of platform that would strengthen the relevance of the Commonwealth. Now, when apartheid South Africa was at its zenith, the role of the Commonwealth helped to clearly define its pathway as a decolonization movement. And that, you know, endeared it to many countries at the time. But since the end of apartheid in South Africa, the Commonwealth has had, you know, very little to cohere together. In other words, the points of convergence have become more difficult to define. But I like the point, Sue, that you made, you know, that, you know, Commonwealth has itself, you know, had the Commonwealth of heads of governments, Commonwealth of civil society, Commonwealth of youths, and Commonwealth of everything. And that is the point that I think, you know, bears serious elaboration in the effort to redefine the Commonwealth. And I will take as my point of departure the many issues that were put together in Kigali. Today, the world is driven by many demands and huge demands for that matter. There are points about, disarmament, about climate change. There are points about migration. There are points about foreign investment, especially from the perspective of the developing countries within the Commonwealth. These kinds of issues are the issues that would, embolden bodies like the Commonwealth to be even more relevant in the scheme of things. Today, there is a very turbulent world, and people are asking for positions, for voices, and so on. The Commonwealth should be part of those kinds of discussions. For many countries in the global South, that are advocates of multilateralism, the Commonwealth is seen as one platform that helps to galvanize the whole strength that they have for coalition building and for concerted efforts. It is for that reason, for instance, that you would find that in Africa, countries that don't have any empire history directly, Mozambique, Rwanda itself, Cameroon, and more recently, Togo and Gabon, which were French-speaking and Portuguese and so on, have found it, pragmatic, to become members of the Commonwealth. What all of these countries are looking for are platforms, international organizations that would help, solidify the voices that they want heard. I think that the Commonwealth must therefore push, in that direction to become more active, in global affairs. Now, economic challenges are very fundamental to the interests of countries of the global South in the Commonwealth. Is the Commonwealth in a position to help countries become more developed? Is it in a position to help address issues of poverty? Is it in a position to address issues of, foreign direct investment? Is it possible, for instance, for the Commonwealth to begin to think along the lines of some common market, a Commonwealth market, for instance? A long time ago, all citizens of the Commonwealth didn't require, visas and so on to move around the Commonwealth. Is it possible that those kinds of things can be reenacted, as a body, so that the Commonwealth can become, an economically powerful instrument, for development? Now, in terms of governance and democratization, now after the end of apartheid in South Africa, the Commonwealth, came on very strongly on the side of democratization. And I'm sure that many member countries, would remember the efforts of the Commonwealth to ensure that, countries, embraced the democratic revolution. Now, that's still a major area of concern. Many countries have democratic deficits. There are even threats, of reversals, and so on. Now, what can the Commonwealth do here? I think that is also a crucial thing. But let me say that, all of these things are at the level of the economy, or at the level of government and governance and so on. But the underbelly, the softer elements of Commonwealth cohesion have always endured. And here I want to talk about the education sector. We have the Association of Commonwealth Universities, that has been very active in bringing together institutions of higher learning, tertiary institutions across the Commonwealth. And in that same sector, we've had the Commonwealth scholarships. We've had, movements of people across the Commonwealth. I know that certainly for many people from Africa, it's been possible to go to the Caribbean. It's been possible to go to Australia and India and so on. Now, these kinds of exchanges are very important. And I hope that the Journalists Forum would borrow a leaf from what the education sector has been able to do under the aegis of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. In the social sector, of course, the Commonwealth Games, there's been a big thing. and next is Birmingham. This excites youths all over the world, excites youths, especially in the Commonwealth, for the simple reason that the Commonwealth Games, offer opportunities for people to become better athletes, to set standards that are world-class related, and even to then begin to compete at the world stage. We've had many young people coming through the Commonwealth Games who have then become world champions in their own rights. So I think that's very crucial. The sports is very closely related to the role of youths in the Commonwealth. And here, I think sports and education would go together. The future of the Commonwealth, would be a future that would be defined by the youths and women also. We must, remember that, the whole thing about inclusivity presupposes that we've had neglect, we've had marginalities, we've even had some exclusions. It is the time to begin to bring to bear the fullness of the Commonwealth, in terms of the generational things and the gender perspectives and so on. So I'm hoping, that as the Commonwealth redefines itself as a platform that is able to address critical issues of socioeconomic development and transformation, address critical issues of the environment, address critical issues of energy, and most of all, address issues of how, the Commonwealth can become a strong actor in the global community. These countries, the poorer, the smaller, the weaker countries, will then have greater reason to embrace the Commonwealth the way it was embraced a long time ago when it offered those opportunities. I'm hoping that the future will be assured to the extent that the Commonwealth, is no longer seen as just, a group of heads of state and heads of governments coming together, but as a group that has, strong non-state presence, that is able to provide some kind of holding space for the private sector, and especially for foreign direct investment in the poorer parts of the Commonwealth. So I think that, Kigali has helped to signpost the reimagining of the Commonwealth along the lines of being a problem-solving organization, along the lines of, an organization that is now a little more focused on dealing with existential issues and not those exoteric issues.
Professor, thank you. Professor, thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that we only have another half hour, and I need to involve others, but thank you very much for your emphasis on hope, and that you believe that Kigali has helped to signpost the way. Sir Ron, if I could invite you to speak now. I know that you hold decided views on the future of the Commonwealth.
Let me just say that, in my view, the Commonwealth went into the Kigali meeting weaker as an organization than it has been for at least a decade. Key leaders before Kigali were accused of racism. There was a significant decline of confidence in the Secretary General by half the member states, especially the ones that contribute the largest sums of money to the Secretariat and the programs of the Commonwealth. This was obvious from the fact that the Secretary General won a contest for the job in Kigali by only 3 votes. An audit report available before the Kigali meeting was not released by the Secretariat, despite previous well-publicized claims of irregularities regarding the award of contracts and claims of very poor management. Now, this raised serious questions in minds of leaders and non-governmental organizations who placed great store in the integrity of the Commonwealth and its reputation. Even though Kigali concluded 5 days ago, it is still unclear how many heads of government attended it, although it is known that many important leaders did not show up. And at the beginning of this session, Sue, you identified some of them. But of course, there were others who did not turn up, including the Prime Minister of India. The largest contributors to the Commonwealth, Britain, Canada, Australia, have already reduced their contributions to the Commonwealth due to concern about its administration. Over the next 2 years, until the next heads of government meeting is held, these countries are unlikely to provide anything but the barest minimum to the Secretariat. The organization is therefore in a lame duck mode until then. In other words, it is in a state of drift at a time when the world is facing a conjoined crisis and is gravely in need of international cooperation and direction, such as the Commonwealth provided in the 3 decades from 1975 to 2005. In a sentence, the Commonwealth went to Kigali weak and rudderless. It has come out of Kigali even weaker and even more divided than it went into Rwanda. At Kigali, Gabon and Togo were admitted as members of the Commonwealth, despite the fact that both countries have very troubling human rights records, including toward freedom of the press, discrimination against women, torture, and disappearance of persons. These 2 countries, even now as we speak, are in violation of the Harare Principles and the Charter of the Commonwealth, both of which established the values and principles for which the Commonwealth stands. And if I were a practicing journalist today, I would want to know how that was possible. It is difficult to see by what objective criteria, including established Commonwealth rules, these countries were permitted admission to the Commonwealth. Now, I will remind that in 2009, in far less troubling global circumstances than we experience today, many Commonwealth leaders were so concerned about the organization that they established a Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group to advise on urgent reform of the Commonwealth. Both Hugh Segal, my co-panelist today, and I were members of that group. And we, along with our colleagues, spent 2 years of our lives doing nothing but being consumed by Commonwealth issues. And at the end of it, we produced a report with 106 recommendations as to how the organization could be improved. Now, among the factors that prompted the decision of Commonwealth leaders in 2009 to look deeply at the organization were these. 1, a decline in attendance at meetings by heads of governments themselves. That situation is worse today. The relevance and efficacy of the Commonwealth in a changing international system. That question is still being asked today. The impact of the Commonwealth on the lives of the people of its member states. That question too permeates the discussion on the Commonwealth. The credibility of the organization, which seemed to eschew the values for which its member states repeatedly declared their commitment. And there we see the same situation today with the admission of Togo and Gabon. And finally, something of interest to the participants today, a lack of interest by the media and the general public in Commonwealth matters. Now, I need hardly say that these conditions continue to exist today, except worse. When the EPG met for close to 2 years and produced a report for the 2011 CHOGM in Perth, in Australia, we made 106 recommendations for reform of the Commonwealth, particularly the intergovernmental machinery, the role of the Secretariat, and the role of the Secretary General. Very few of the recommendations were implemented. and some of the more important ones were rejected out of hand by many of the governments. Among the recommendations that were rejected was the establishment of a Commissioner for Democracy and the Rule of Law. There were some Commonwealth countries that simply did not want to even have a discussion on whether democracy was really secure in Commonwealth countries and whether there was a need to do something about it. Now, the recommendations were developed after 18 months of intense analysis of the organization, based incidentally on over 300 submissions from Commonwealth organizations and numerous other individual presentations, as well as scrutiny of the Secretariat's budget and work program. Implementation of many of the original recommendations today remain unfulfilled, but they are the core of a new agenda and a purpose for the Commonwealth that would make the association more relevant and beneficial to its members. Now, having concluded that inquiry and confronting the challenges the association faces, the members of the EPG collectively stated the following: in an era of changing economic circumstances and uncertainty, of new trade and economic patterns, of unprecedented threats to peace and security, which incidentally is worsened now with the aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the challenge to the international legal order. In addition, a surge in popular demands for democracy, human rights, and broadened economic opportunities. The potential of the Commonwealth as a compelling force for good and as an effective network for cooperation and for promoting development is unparalleled. I need not say to this audience why the Commonwealth is all of that. It was, as our colleague from Nigeria pointed out earlier, very important in the role that it played in fighting racism in Southern Africa. But it was also important on many economic issues through the work of groups of experts from Commonwealth countries who labored together to create blueprints that were advanced into the international community and encouraged necessary change. And those things had to do with climate change. The discussion on climate change started in the Commonwealth. It had to do with the wider environment. It had to do with disarmament. It had to do with how one dealt with small states, 32 of whom are members of the Commonwealth. All of these were issues with which the Commonwealth dealt. But unfortunately, we have seen a division developing in the Commonwealth, a North-South division, a fight for control of what the Commonwealth stands for. Instead of the cooperation that we saw in the past, we are now seeing open hostility. Now, if the Commonwealth can remain cohesive, rooted in the values that authenticate it within its member states and in the international community, by managing and harmonizing the diversity of its membership, rather than highlighting them and using them as a source of division, it may be able to play a vital role in the future, such as it did in the past. That is the task before it. Whether it can achieve it will be left to be seen. But there are questions here for journalists who are really interested in probing these issues. Thank you very much.
Sir Ron, thank you very much indeed. So a sharply different perspective from Nigeria and Professor Osaghae. So if I could now ask Hugh Segal, please, to make your presentation.
Thank you, Susan, and it's a great privilege to hear both Sir Ronald and our colleague from Nigeria and to be part of this discussion. I actually recall going to a Commonwealth Journalists Association meeting in Malta when I was my country's special representative for human rights, rule of law to the Commonwealth. And I remember very much the strong the level of debate and engagement, which was very much part of what my responsibilities were and what the CJA was so supportive of in terms of underlining the critical issues that the Commonwealth faced. On March the 11th, 2013, Her Majesty the Queen left a sickbed at Buckingham Palace and came to Marlborough House to sign the Charter of the Commonwealth. And that charter was one of the recommendations that the Eminent Persons Group, which Sir Ronald and I and others were members, had made very forcefully in terms of an overall declaration of values and purpose. And in that document which she signed, it said, and I quote, "We recognize the inalienable right of individuals to participate in democratic processes, in particular through free and fair elections, in shaping the society in which they live. Governments, political parties, and civil society are responsible for upholding and promoting democratic culture and practices, and are accountable to the public in this regard. Parliaments and representative local governments and other forms of local governance are essential elements in the exercise and of democratic governance." So the question we have to ask ourselves, if the Commonwealth is a different organization from NATO, which is about defense, from the WTO, which is about trade, if it's a different organization than the OECD, which is about the wealthy countries doing the kind of economic analysis that's constructive for public policy, how is it different? It's different because it's an organization that is framed around values. As our colleague from Nigeria so eloquently stated, it emerged from the old colonial history of the British Empire to a commonwealth of equal countries working together for common purposes. Now, if that organization is going to be relevant, as Sir Ronald underlined, it has to stand for something. It can't just stand for people meeting on a regular basis, because meeting on a regular basis is a fun thing to do. No government worth its salt has the time or the resources to be part of an organization which actually has no impact on the quality of life of their own residents. And I think the challenge we face now is the extent to which we are prepared to say the values are essential. And if you're going to be a member of the Commonwealth, you have to not only sign on for those values, you have to demonstrate that those values are real in your society. And as a government, you're doing the very best you can to achieve that. I accept without hesitation that different countries will be at different stages and different cultures will have different approaches to how these matters are addressed. And it's important that the Commonwealth always be tolerant in that respect and embracing of the benefit of diversity in that context. But the notion that we would continue to admit countries that have no shred of democracy, and we wouldn't even admit them on a conditional basis, so there would be some time for them to make some progress. I note that with our friends in the EU and even with our friends in NATO, when countries ask for admission, it's not automatic. They actually have to prove that they meet the criteria. The political criteria of NATO around democracy, for example, the EU's criteria around democracy and presumption of innocence. We need to be absolutely certain that the Commonwealth will continue to impose those standards, because if we don't, then the purpose of the organization will be in question. And I have to say that when I went to the Maldives back in 2013 to deal with what was a coup d'etat against a duly elected government, and I was sent by my government to meet with all the participants and to see how we could move the Maldives back to democracy at that point. And I was following the visit of the then Secretary General, McKinnon, who had visited the Maldives and done a detailed analysis of the problems. It occurred to me very, very clearly that the Commonwealth's fundamental purpose was to be a force for democracy and rule of law in as many countries as possible. And when I found out upon my arrival that the leaders of the coup had retained then Baroness Scotland as a legal advisor to give them advice for which she was paid, not to take the Commonwealth and its commitment to democracy as a matter of any seriousness, I realized that we had a serious problem in terms of consistency and in terms of hypocrisy. So no organization is perfect. All organizations have to make changes over time, but I think we need to be frank about the difficulties that we face. The good that the Commonwealth does through many civil associations, some of which were listed by our academic colleague from Nigeria, some of which are real and are constructive in terms of professional and other associations, should not in any way be diminished. But the purpose of the organization, the underlying values of democracy and freedom and human rights and presumption of innocence cannot be set aside. And I would argue as strenuously as I can that part of the mission of the Commonwealth Journalist Association, which only they can discharge, is to hold governments to account when there is a huge contradiction between their membership in an organization like the Commonwealth of Nations on the one hand, and their actual practices in their own domestic circumstance. And absent that holding of accountability, that measure of accountability, then we face the risk of the kind of drift that Sir Ronald has so eloquently stated and reflected on earlier. One final point. The vast majority of the population within our Commonwealth countries are under the age of 40. And the level of unemployment amongst that population throughout the Commonwealth is massive. So we have to remember that whatever else the Commonwealth should be doing, one of the purposes of supporting democracy and development is to be able to work collectively to reduce the levels of poverty in those countries so that more and more people can actually participate in their own societies and live more fruitful and happy lives. Poverty is at the root of early illness. Poverty is at the root of people dying younger than they should. Poverty is at the root of difficulty with the law, and it's often the root of difficulty with illegal drugs. So that fundamental underlying premise for international development has to be contextualized within a democratic framework. And I think we will have to somehow get through the next 2 years with the existing Secretary General. I regret the decision taken by a small margin to re-elect her. But we need to be frank about the accountability she must face and the rest of the Commonwealth Secretariat has to face on these issues that are essential to the purposes of the organization. And I'm delighted to take questions or personal attacks from anyone here listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Segal. I'd like to put one question to each of the panelists for each of them to answer before I open to the floor. In view of the divergence of view that you've each expressed between what the Commonwealth has been for, what it could be for, where it stands at the moment, is it capable of reform? Sir Ron, would you care to answer that question?
Well, Sue, the question actually forces me to confront an issue that has been swirling in my mind now for several years. You ask if the Commonwealth is capable of reform. The question is, who's going to reform the Commonwealth? Where does that power lie? The power lies essentially in heads of government. They are the ultimate decision makers. To reform the Commonwealth, they have to be convinced that the Commonwealth is an organization in which the effort that is needed to reform it is necessary. They had a report from the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group that heads of government established that gave them 106 recommendations for reform, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it because they were divided, because some people saw their own interests not being served by it. It wasn't whether we can engineer this organization so that it benefits each of our member states and all of them collectively. The view was, this thing is a threat to me and to my government and to the way I administer my country, and therefore I'm not going that route. It seems to me that governments have reached the point in the Commonwealth where they have become It's become a club of people who, in a phrase that I learned from Hugh Segal some time ago, they go along to get along. And because they're going along to get along, nothing's happening. They are all mistaking movement for progress. So you could be jumping on the same spot. That's movement, but you haven't gone anywhere. And that, unfortunately, is the situation in which the Commonwealth now finds itself. The thing needs evangelical leadership. It needs people who have the passion of belief that this diversity of peoples across every single continent of the world could become together a force for good in the world on issues such as the one fundamental thing that Hugh Segal has just pointed out, for instance, that poverty is the root of almost every evil that we face. And therefore, we should be contextualizing it in the context in which the Commonwealth could be addressing how we deal with this. And the Commonwealth has done things like this in the past. It has moved away. It's lost its moorings. The ship is now adrift. And unless there is a captain willing to point the direction once again to safe waters where it can actually begin to produce the reimagination about which our colleague from Nigeria talked about earlier, it's not going to happen. So the question is it capable of reform? So I hope so, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. Mr. Segal, what's your view?
Susan, I would say that the beginning of reform would be a very simple affirmation by the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Committee when it next meets. And it would go something like this. We accept the principle that many of the members now in the Commonwealth will no longer be members because they are not democracies. They do not respect the presumption of innocence. They do not respect human rights. And we will prepare a list of those countries that do not conform, and that will be addressed at the next meeting in 2 years' time. That would be the beginning of a very serious effort at reform, because it would make it perfectly clear that the Commonwealth as an organization is about underlying values, not about just adding members, many of whom do not in any way, shape, or form reflect the underlying democratic principles upon which the organization was built. So it wouldn't take, it would take all the effort that has been described by Sir Ronald, but it wouldn't take 1,000 initiatives to begin the reform. One simple statement by CMAG, the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Committee, would begin the process. And it would be dynamic. That would be in some respects difficult and challenging, but worthwhile things are often difficult and challenging. And when the Commonwealth stepped up on difficult issues like Sri Lanka and like South Africa, that was a difficult proposition, as was the Maldives. And those are the sorts of places where you have to make a stand to actually stand for anything.
Thank you very much indeed. We have time for questions from the floor. There's a question here from Dr. Kiran Hassan. Are there other questions? Okay. If I could take two questions together, please.
Thank
Kiran.
you so much. Thank you all, the panelists, for a very, very comprehensive kind of discussion on this very important topic. My question is to Sir Ronald. You said that the Commonwealth played a very, very critical role in the conversation around climate change. I was wondering, how can media at the moment help in bringing up that conversation, highlighting the issues around Commonwealth, around climate change within the Commonwealth countries? Thank you.
Thank you. And also a question from Raymond Whitaker, together, please.
Yes. The Commonwealth was described earlier, I think, by you, Sue, as a network of networks. And my question to both of the panelists is, can those useful networks like the CJA, Commonwealth Lawyers Association, can they survive when we're admitting members who don't share a common legal heritage, don't, in fact, speak English? All the four latest new members are non-English speaking states, which for the journalists is obviously a bit of a problem.
Thank you very much. A question, Sir Ron, about media and climate change, and then the broader question from Mr. Whitaker for both of you.
Well, Sue, I think this is a critical issue that the media should be addressing. Climate change is an existential threat. Now, we talk about it is an existential threat to small island states and countries with low-lying coasts. The truth is, it's an existential threat to everybody. I'm in the United States right now, and over the last year, this country has had so many environmental threats to it as a result of climate change that were it not for the fact that it's a vast country with great resources, it would not have easily survived it. You know, the small islands exemplify this problem because one hurricane destroys our countries overnight. In 1 hour, 10 years of gross domestic product can vanish. The whole country can be crippled, every industry wrecked. So we exemplify a real problem which exists in the rest of the world. Hugh Segal will tell you that in Canada, there are problems of the environment being caused by climate change. There are droughts, there are floods, there are forest fires, there are all kinds of things that are increasing in their intensity and also in their frequency. We have a real problem. But in the Commonwealth itself, we have countries that are huge emitters, and we have countries that are the victims of all of this. So there should be a conversation at the Commonwealth between those countries that are the big emitters, such as India, such incidentally as Canada, which is amongst the top 10, Britain, which is also a significant emitter. All of these issues should be discussed in the Commonwealth, and there should be some at least acknowledgement that climate change is a threat to everyone, but more particularly to small countries, and it needs addressing. And it is not sufficient for countries like India to say, well, we're a developing country, and therefore we should be allowed to emit as much of the CO2 as necessary for development because rich countries have already achieved it. That may be a fact, but that's not a reason for doing it. And because you're killing other people at your own you're getting better at the expense of others. Is it worth the elimination of entire civilizations that have existed for centuries simply to achieve 10 years of development more rapidly than you would if you did it at a slower pace? I mean, these are questions that need addressing, and the media needs to confront them. It needs to bring governments to account on it. And it needs to encourage the conversation. Needs to ask questions of the Secretariat as to why it is you've not put this together. Why have you not gathered the group of experts from across the Commonwealth, from Britain, a big emitter, from India, a big emitter, to small countries, sitting them in a room and saying, okay, you the experts, come up with a plan that the Commonwealth can embrace and take forward in the international community. But yes, the media has a responsibility to do it, and they should.
Thank you very much indeed. And your response to Raymond Whitaker's question about including countries with speaking French, different legal systems, questionable standards of democracy and observance of human rights, is the Commonwealth eroding itself from within?
Well, so everybody knows that one of the reasons the Commonwealth has survived for so long is not because of the official Commonwealth and heads of government meetings that happen every 2 years, or even the ministerial meetings that happen every few months. It is the fact that we have 92 active non-governmental organizations of people who believe that their Commonwealth links gives them an opportunity for wider consultation to make their own circumstances better within their national environments and to contribute to a Commonwealth solution to problems that face the world. They are extremely important. Will the expansion of the Commonwealth include non-English speaking countries matter? It will to some extent, but I am now the ambassador. In addition to being ambassador to the United States, I'm ambassador to the Organization of American States, where we have countries that speak English, Spanish, French, Portuguese. And we have had to learn to live with each other and to see how best we can still combine our resources to address some of the problems about which the questioner just asked. We overcome that by having translation on an immediate basis for every conversation that we have. Now, the Commonwealth will have to reorient itself. It will now have to stop issuing papers only in English. It will have to issue them in all of the languages of the countries that we've just admitted: Rwanda, Mozambique, Angola, Gabon, and Togo. And we will also have to start a whole system of interpretation. And how NGOs are going to do that, I don't know. It's going to be very difficult for them. But of course, the official Commonwealth could do it, but only at great expense. But I believe that a more fundamental question does still arise, even if we get over the linguistic issue. And that is the question, I think, put by the question himself about culture and about history and about laws. You know, if you operate in an environment in which you speak the same language, you come out of the same cultural background, questions of race become less important because you still have an identity, and that makes communication, conversation, and everything better. So it is, and at the end of all of this is, do you have the same approach to these issues of human rights, of democracy, of the rule of law? And if you don't, then it makes those things difficult. I have practical experience of this now. In the last year, I have had, as an ambassador in the Organization of American States, to lead a charge to have Nicaragua suspended from the Organization of American States because of its human rights record. I've also had to lead a charge to have Russia suspended as an observer nation to the Organization of American States because of its aggression against Russia, against Ukraine. So hard decisions had to be made, and hard decisions will have to be made in the Commonwealth as well if they are to retain the values and principles for which they stand, and which incidentally are the basis for those non-governmental organizations that work so hard voluntarily to keep the idea of the Commonwealth alive.
Thank you very much, Sir Ron. Mr. Segal, if I could ask you to briefly make your remarks, because I need to draw this fascinating panel discussion to a close so the next panel can begin. But if you could respond to that final question, please.
I agree with everything Sir Ronald said, and I would add one tiny, very brief thought. Were I a journalist interested in the Commonwealth, I'd be looking for new ways, new innovative ways to cover some of these issues that would retain public interest right across the Commonwealth. There is a group of scientists who've had a doomsday clock for a very long time about the nuclear threat. I think we need to have a doomsday clock on climate change, and I think it should reflect what's going on in the Commonwealth and should appear in every newspaper, on every media outlet throughout the Commonwealth on a regular basis, so that we are focused on actually what the problem is and how serious it is and how quickly we must address it.
Thank you very much indeed. My thanks to our three expert panelists with their different perspectives, who've underlined the importance that hard decisions will need to be made. The potential is there. Whether the capacity and the commitment is there, of course, remains to be seen. And calling on young journalists to call power to account, to speak truth to power, yes, and also to be innovative in how you cover these challenges which directly face you and your generation. So thank you very much indeed.